Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. Maurice Hirsch, joined by Izabella Tabarovsky today, and Yoni Ben Menachem. Today is the 23rd day of the war with Gaza. As we always do, just a recap of where we are and how we got here. On the morning of the 7th of October, 2023, it was Shabbat morning, it was Simchat Torah. Some 3,000 terrorists from Gaza infiltrated Israel. They swarmed 30 different civilian areas, villages, cities, towns, kibbutzim, slaughtering everyone that they could. Babies, women, children, the elderly, the disabled. No one was spared from their wrath. As we heard yesterday, and I apologize again for this graphic description, the first responders from Zaka even found, and really I do apologize for this, even found a baby in an oven. They literally put our babies in ovens, with all that image conjures up for everyone. They murdered and massacred over 1,400 people. They injured another 5,240. They took another probably as many as 250, but now there are 235 confirmed cases of hostage taking. Of them, we have 33 children, 10 of whom are under the age of 5, and 18 people over the age of 75. Again, as they did with the killing and maiming and murdering and raping, they did not spare anyone, even from taking hostages. Even little Kfir Bibas, who was just 9 months old, everyone was taken. They did all the initial attack under the fire of thousands of rockets that they initially launched to cover their operation on the ground and to cover their atrocities. They fired some 3,000 rockets on the first day, and since then, in the past 23 days, they've managed to fire almost 5,000 extra rockets, bringing the total since the 7th of October to over 8,000 rockets that have been fired by the terrorists, indiscriminately targeting Israel's civilian population. Many of those rockets, we have to remember, also fell within the Gaza Strip, with hundreds of rockets killing and maiming also Palestinians. We heard, for example, and everyone I'm sure saw it on the news, the incident of the El Hali hospital, where it was initially claimed by the Hamas authorities that Israel had attacked the hospital intentionally, killing 500 people. It turned out very soon that it was actually a misfired rocket of Palestinian Islamic Jihad that fell in the vicinity of the hospital, killing 12 people. Obviously, no one updated the figures as to how many people had been killed. The narrative is still good. The Palestinian Authority is still pushing that number out. And if we're talking about the Palestinian Authority, so we also have to mention that among the terrorists who swarmed Israel on that black morning of the 7th of October were terrorists from the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, which is a branch of Fatah, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, and also terrorists from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a communist terrorist organization. Also, they are part of the PLO, also headed by Mahmoud Abbas. This is our ostensible moderate peace partner, who some consider to be the future for Gaza. And we at the Jerusalem Center do not agree on that. That's on the southern front. From the terrorists have continued their efforts to infiltrate Israel from all destinations, by tunnels, by ground, by sea, and luckily until now, all of those infiltrations have ended with the death of the terrorists. The fighting now, Israel has been fighting back, obviously, since the 7th of October. And we are now standing today with somewhere in the region of 11,300 strikes in Gaza by the Israeli Air Force over the last 23 days. Of those, 600 in the last 24 hours. What we've seen in the last 3 days already, starting Wednesday night, and then again on Thursday night, were ground force infiltrations or passages into Gaza by IDF forces, who initially went in and withdrew starting Friday night. There's a much more extensive ground force operation going on in Gaza, with the latest reports, open reports, describing IDF forces already at the outskirts of Gaza City, the Zaytun neighborhood, and with the forces slowly moving forward during these hours of fighting. The IDF forces have managed to guide on the ground, have managed to guide 150 of the airstrikes that the Air Forces carried out. So that presence in the Gaza Strip is clearly showing its worth. In addition, there have been dozens of terrorists who have been killed in the fighting, also on the ground. Thankfully, as we speak, there have been no Israeli casualties on the ground fighting in the Gaza Strip. That's already on the southern front. On the northern front, Hezbollah, we have seen continued sporadic rocket fire and anti-tank fire coming from Hezbollah, and the IDF responding. There are over 50 Hezbollah casualties during this already. What is clearly albeit dormant war, but a war that's going on there. Yesterday we saw for the first time rocket attacks into Kiryat Shmone, where thankfully most of the population, Israeli population, has been evacuated. Both when you include the southern areas where 120,000 Israelis have been internally displaced, and you then on the northern area, we're talking about 250,000 Israelis that are running around Israel, displaced from their homes, forced to leave because of the terrorist and rocket threat. That's where we're standing on the northern front. In Judea and Samaria, the terrorists are also trying to continue their efforts to carry out terrorist attacks. We've seen a number of shooting attacks, a stabbing attack this afternoon in Jerusalem, and other dozens of attacks going on all the time. The rocket fire, I forgot to say, from Gaza is continuing on even today. Just an hour and a half ago, rockets falling in the area of Jerusalem, southern Jerusalem, coming up to Gush Etzion. They're really very close to much of the civilian population. The rocket that fell in Gush Etzion was also not far from Arab population centers. So it's not clear exactly what they're trying to do there. On the internal front, at the moment, we are still seeing a relative calm from the Israeli Arab population. There was much fear initially that we would see a recurrence of the violence in May 2021, when many of the Israeli Arab population, or some of the Israeli population, we can't say many, also joined Hamas in the war against Israel, burning shuls, carrying out pogroms predominantly in the mixed cities. So far, we've seen relative calm on that front, although there do appear to be reports of a potential explosion coming also from that direction. So that's something that we're monitoring all the time. The hot subject at the moment, the hot subject is a wrong word. It's an evil word, I would say, even of my own language, that we're seeing at the moment running around the propaganda apparatus of Hamas is a video of 3 of the Israeli hostages, 3 women, really condemning Prime Minister Netanyahu. We won't get into the details of the video, and we won't show it because we won't play into the hands of the Hamas propaganda. But now it appears they really are in quite a desperate situation, and what we had originally assessed is now unfortunately coming to fruition, and they are using the hostages, forcing them to give out messages. Obviously, if anyone sees these videos, you should take into account that these are hostages being held by genocidal terrorists. They've probably seen half of their families, if not all of their families, massacred by the terrorists, and therefore anything you say, whilst you may see that in the frame, innocent people sitting there and talking to the camera, you can just imagine to yourselves the guns and the Kalashnikovs pointed at them, at the heads of their loved ones, at the heads of their friends who are sitting there watching this grotesque experience. Today, what we're going to discuss, just before Yoni gives an extra update, what we're going to discuss today with Izabella, and that's really Isabella's speciality, is Russia. Where is Russia in all of this event? How do they side? Are they siding with the terrorists? Are they siding with Israel? As we know, in the periods for the past 5 or so years, Russia and Israel had managed to come to an operational agreement almost in Syria, which guaranteed the Israeli Air Force almost a free hand operating in Syria against the transfer of weapons from Iran on the one side to Hezbollah via Syria. And so relatively, I would say, even good operational relations. We'll talk about Russia, Russia, I would say, is probably and Putin is probably one of the happiest people in the world to see the 7th of October massacre, not necessarily because they're happy about the murder of Jews, but because it took the international heat off Russia and the atrocities that are taking place in the Ukraine. So that obviously for Russia was something which was very welcome. And we'll see how that also plays into the whole scheme of things with Russia and Qatar, and we'll discuss that with Izabella. But first, an additional update from Yoni, please.
Yes, I will talk shortly about what is happening in the north of Gaza Strip, and then I'll move to my main presentation about Iran attrition war against Israel. What we see now, the situation on the ground is the IDF managed to make a big incursion into the north of Gaza, and is moving forward toward the city of Gaza. I saw a few videos that Palestinians in Gaza distributed, and you can clearly see some Israeli tanks in the outskirts of Gaza City, like Zaytun neighborhood. There's a blackout by the IDF about all the details of the military operation. We can only talk about the information that the IDF spokesperson is distributing, and the general picture is that the IDF is moving forward and closing on Hamas in Gaza City itself. We will not talk about the location of the Israeli forces. This is just a general description. And I'm sure that in the evening, the IDF's spokesperson will give us more details. But this is very important. This blackout is good. The Israeli public should not know now the exact details, but it's very important to keep Hamas in the dark and not let him understand anything about the IDF planning and the movements on the ground. This is part of the psychological pressure also, and the military pressure that the IDF is exerting on Hamas. I want to talk about the attrition war of Iran against Israel. A week ago, actually, Iran started an attrition war against Israel from all the fronts, from Lebanon by Hezbollah, Gaza by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Judea and Samaria by the terror organization, mostly in Samaria area, Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarem, East Jerusalem. There was today a terror attack by a terrorist in East Jerusalem who stabbed a policeman, Israeli policeman, with a knife, but he was shot by the other policeman and killed. And also from Yemen, as we mentioned last week, the Houthis in Yemen, they launched missiles and drones from Yemen towards Israel. Now, apparently, they are starting, Iran is also opening a front from Syria with the pro-Iranian militias, the Shiite militias in Syria. And yesterday, they launched 4 rockets from Syria towards Israel. They landed in an open area. There were no casualties, but at night, according to foreign sources, the IDF or the Israeli Air Force attacked the launchers of these militias in Syria, in Daraa area in the south of Syria, and destroyed the launcher. These militias, pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq, also attacked a few days ago with rockets and drones the bases of the American army in Iraq and in Syria, and there were a few attacks, and 29 American soldiers were injured in these attacks. In response, the Americans attacked two facilities in the east of Syria that are used by the Revolutionary Guards, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and other militias that are connected to them. The Muhammad al-Sudani, the Prime Minister of Iraq, had a few meetings with the leaders of what is called the Islamic resistance. These are the militias in Iraq. And he tried to stop the attacks on the American soldiers. He warned them that the Americans might move to a new strategy of targeted killings of the heads of these pro-Iranian militias. The presence of the pro-Iranian militias in Syria is not new. They entered Syria in 2011 by the order of Iran, and they were fighting in the civil war, assisting President Bashar Assad to oppress his people, to fight against the organization of the Syrian opposition. At that time, Iran did not allow them to attack Israel. They were only concentrating on the enemies of Bashar Assad. But now Israel is watching very closely the activity of these militias. A few days ago, according to foreign sources, Israel attacked targets in the airport of Damascus and Aleppo after having intelligence information that the Iranians are sending weapons through airplanes to supply the militias with new weapons to attack Israel. The American Foreign Minister, Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he called the Prime Minister of Iraq, Muhammad al-Sudani, to prosecute all those heads of militias who are in charge of launching the rockets and drones towards American bases in Iraq and in Syria. The Iraqi government doesn't know what to do. They issued a statement where they condemned the attacks on the American forces on the basis of the foreign forces in Iraq, claiming that these forces' presence is intended to fight against the ISIS, and nobody should attack them. These are, as far as the pro-Iranian militias are concerned. There are other forces in Iraq who are loyal to the Shia Imam Muqtada Sadr, and they are calling to organize marches of the masses, not with weapons, marches of the masses towards the border of Palestine, so-called Palestine, of course, from Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. And we have now a situation that about 7,000 Shiite protesters from Iraq reached the border with Jordan, and they are demanding the Jordanian authority to move into Jordan, to allow them to enter to Jordan so they can get to the border with Israel. Of course, the Jordanian army did not allow that. They're still waiting on the border, and the Jordanian army beefed up its presence along the border with Iraq. Security sources in Israel estimate that while the military operation, the ground invasion of the IDF will get wider and wider in Gaza in order to topple the Hamas regime and destroy the military infrastructure, Iran will order the Iranian militias, the Shiite militias, that will order them to increase the attacks on Israel by rockets and drones. This is the estimation. Now Israel is in this war is facing for the first time many attacks from several fronts simultaneously. And this is the new Iranian strategy called unification of fronts, that the father of this strategy was Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by the Americans in Iraq. Israel is now focusing on the main objective, and this is to topple the Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. But at the same time, it is also fighting and retaliating for each attack that is coming from the different fronts. Senior officials in Israel saying that Iran will pay the price at the right time. Now we have to finish the war in Gaza against Hamas, but Israel remembers what has been done by the Iranians, and they will pay the price in the right time.
Indeed, Yoni. We're waiting to see exactly what will happen on all of those different fronts. It's clear that Iran played an integral part in this whole attack, in orchestrating the attack. Obviously, the evidence coming out now of the Hamas and other terrorists who actually went out through Egypt and were training in Iran to carry out the terror attacks. The weapons that the Iranians provided, as we mentioned just a few days ago, just the weapons that were seized on the terrorists at the scene of the massacre leave no place for a doubt of Iran's heavy involvement in the massacre itself. And on that note, we want to go, Izabella, to you. What's going on with Russia? What is Russia? How does Russia see the war that's going on here? What does Putin want? Is he our friend? Is he our enemy? What's going on there?
Well, I think for Putin, this war definitely is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to distract the world from the crisis in Ukraine, from the disaster that's unfolded in Ukraine over the last year and a half. And what was notable about Putin's response is that he kind of immediately started making calls and kind of reconnecting on the subject with various Arab states. But Israel, President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu was the last person in the region that he called. I think it was like day 9 or something like that after the crisis. In the presentations and the talks that Putin has made, and he's made a couple of statements, kind of more or less official statements on the crisis, he never condemned Hamas, which was very notable. And he kind of proposed this rhetoric, which was sort of very balanced, trying to appeal to everyone a little bit, which, makes us think that it's he's kind of aiming for a position of a moderator, because Russia has relationships with all the players in the region. It has relationships with Hamas. It has a relationship with Abu Mazen. With Abu Mazen, it's a very long-term relationship that goes back into the Soviet times. And so a position of a kind of mediator, negotiator is a very favorable one for Russia at the moment. But the fact that it failed to condemn Hamas, of course, is a signal to Israel that Putin is not a friend.
He's not a friend, and that whole system that he's developing around him of trying to play that double game of on the one side deflecting attention away from the Ukraine, on the other hand trying to get into the region and use his power and his influence. Does he have that influence over Iran? We saw, I don't know, just immediately after the war started, the UN sanctions against Iran. Preventing and really stopping anyone from helping the Iranian ballistic missile effort came to an end. And one of the first countries to say, we no longer obviously see ourselves limited, was Russia. Is Russia more helping Iran, or are they more interested in maintaining some type of a relationship, whatever's left of it, with Israel and the West?
I think that at this stage, when it's unclear where things are going, Russia is interested in maintaining a relationship with everyone. It's interesting because even, in that statement, even as Putin attacked the United States, and it attacked the US it attacked the it sort of attributed the current crisis to the failure of American policy in the Middle East. It said that it's a representation of the fact that the United States attempted to monopolize the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it didn't do it right, and it was wrong in its approach. And at the same time, however, he proposed what in very general terms sounds very much like what the United States has been doing, a two-state solution. And so I think that he's trying to create an opening for potentially the United States to come in and perhaps discuss something that some crisis will arise that will make the United States and Israel want to turn to Russia. And then that will open the door to other conversations, because right now there is really the American Russian relationship is shot to pieces. There's no dialogue, there's no conversation. But there's a hope in Moscow, I believe, that this crisis may open the door for a conversation about Ukraine.
Is that what Putin's really looking for? An opportunity to reopen the doors that have been closed, to show himself someone who is again relevant and an international actor, as opposed to being a pariah, almost a pariah state after they invaded Ukraine, and after all of the financial repercussions of that as well, losing their deals, their gas deals with Europe. Russia's taken a very big hit in the last year and a half, rightly so, after they invaded the Ukraine. So why can't Putin clearly say that Hamas is terrorist, because he still wants to maintain that relationship with them?
I believe so, yes. Yes, Hamas is a relatively frequent visitor in Moscow. Hamas visited Moscow, I think, twice last year, and it was just in Moscow recently. It didn't meet with Putin. It met with some senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And Hamas continually expresses its gratitude to Russia, and it views it as a supporter. So I think that Putin understands that one of Russia's strengths right now, and Russia has lost a lot of prestige and a lot of kind of weight in the region since the end of the Cold War, but one of its strengths is its ability to talk to everyone. And so I would guess, and we don't have specific information, it's not like the Kremlin comes out and says it, but I would guess that Russia also positions itself as potentially being able to play a role in negotiating over the hostage crisis, and for that it needs to remain kind of on good terms with Hamas. I think that Moscow's strategy very often, and not just here, but in general, is to, with regards to foreign policy, is to keep the options open, and to stay and to see how things develop, so that then they can kind of in a very targeted manner approach a situation and offer a solution.
So, as I mentioned in the opening words, Russia had almost agreed tacitly or by inaction for Israel to attack almost any Iranian weapons moving from Iran through Syria into Syria into Lebanon to Hezbollah. That would seem to suggest that he's more that Putin was more trying to come towards Israel as opposed towards Iran. Now that seems to have flipped entirely. Where is that support for Iran suddenly coming up? Do they have strategic relations from beforehand? And what happened to those relationships as a result of, I don't know, UN sanctions and the war in the Ukraine?
Well, I think that the war in Ukraine is a critical factor here. Of course, Iran is supplying Russia with its drones, and I think that that's a really important important factor that has strengthened the relationship.
The drones that we're now seeing are from where? From Russia? The Iranians are using, that the Iranians are sending around, these are originally Russian drones? Is that
the Iranians are supplying their drones to Russia to use in the war?
Oh, the other way around.
Right.
Just on. Exactly. Iran is now supplying Russia with the drones to use in the Ukraine.
Exactly.
Right. And so that strategic relationship then has developed over the last period, over the last years, because that would seem to be a double game. Iran, on the one hand, is supplying Russia with weapons to attack in the Ukraine, but Russia is allowing Israel to destroy the weapons that the same Iran is then sending to its proxies in Hezbollah. How do you explain that contradiction?
Well, I'm not sure I have a clear explanation. I think it is a matter of balancing different interests, and whatever it is that Russia, if Russia is to maintain a relationship with Israel, then it probably calculates that it's going to give it here, but then give to Iran on the other side. And I think Iran also at this point, when Russia is so isolated, it's the relationship with Iran. It's like they are partners against the West and against the Western world. So that partnership is strengthening there as well, kind of symbolically. But again, the relationship with Israel remains, and Russia hasn't gone openly against Israel. It just seems like it downgraded its relationship, but it's still there.
But it's still operating, as we heard, as Yoni mentioned also in his introduction. We've seen also in the last few days what appeared to be a continuation of that almost security coordination between Israel and Russia, with attacks on more what we can only assume is more weapons transport in Syria. So really, Russia is trying to keep that position of a neutral, equally evil to all sides.
Well, that's right. I wouldn't necessarily call it neutral, because I think that right now Russia is definitely trying to play much more toward the Arab world. Those relationships go much deeper. That there's decades of that relationship, as we know, from the Cold War onward. And Russia, of course, has a significant Muslim population, and so it needs to also maintain, kind of consider what does all of that mean with regards to its Muslim citizens. And just yesterday, we saw the events in Makhachkala, where it's the capital of Dagestan, where there was essentially an anti-Semitic riot. We're still trying to figure out, was it provoked, who provoked it, what caused it, there seem to be indications that it was organized. And I'll just remind, perhaps for the listeners, if
that's exactly what it was.
If they're not
in the airport, the whole almost lynch that was carried out,
exactly,
crazed people looking for the Jews to dispose of them.
Exactly. Some 1,500 people, I believe the estimate is now, broke into the airport in Makhachkala, which is the capital of Dagestan. It's a republic in northern Caucasus. It's part of Russia. Muslim majority. So they rushed through the terminal, full of rage. They were told, they had information that Israeli refugees were coming to Dagestan, fleeing the war. And so they were looking for Israelis and Jews. They emphasized it was both. So they looked through the airplane that had just arrived from Tel Aviv on its way to Moscow. It was supposed to be a connection point. They searched buses. They even looked in the airplane engine. I mean, it was really just, it was like people were just sort of beset by this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And, in the end, the riots ended. Today, we know that some 50 people, I believe, were arrested. And just recently, we heard that Putin is about to hold a massive high-level kind of consultation with his security organs to discuss what happened. It's a very damaging episode potentially for Putin, not only because he positions himself as, he positions Russia as a country that has that defended Jews, where Jews have always lived well, which of course is completely not true. But referencing the World War II and the Red Army victory over Nazi Germany and the liberation of the camps, again, very simplified black and white rhetorics. But also, this whole issue, the Jewish issue, has played a very big role in Russia's propaganda with regards to Ukraine. Russia has claimed that Ukraine is run by Nazis. It has really kind of abused the Jewish identity of Zelensky, some very anti-Semitic rhetoric around that, both by Putin and by Russian propaganda channels. And if this obviously, this event undermines all of that, right? It's like you're pointing to Ukraine and saying that they're Nazis, but you have anti-Semitic mobs running through your streets on your own. And I'll just add one more thing. I think that an additional factor here, and I haven't seen it discussed a lot in the news yet, but I think it's important. And it's the fact that Dagestan is neighbor with Chechnya, and Chechnya is run by a Putin man, a strong man, Ramzan Kadyrov, who has played also a role in Ukraine, sending his troops to Ukraine, where they're known for their brutality and cruelty. And very quickly after October 7th, he showed up on his Telegram channel and said that Chechnya stands for the Palestinian people and is willing to send troops into Gaza to defend the Palestinian people. He called for a ceasefire. He said that his troops would, fight anyone who doesn't uphold the ceasefire. And since then, if you look at his Telegram channel, there are very frequent statements about fascist Israel and the genocide in Gaza, and about the prayers that are carried out throughout Chechnya for the benefit of the Palestinian people. And so I imagine that there is incitement going on that would not, it would not take much to incite a mob to conduct a pogrom.
But that's what we're talking about Russia in general. Is it a fundamentally anti-Semitic country? Is that a one-off incident just because it's a predominantly Muslim population? Is it something that the Russian authorities promote? We know, at least going back to the Soviet Union, Putin and his KGB history, we know that the KGB and Abbas also have their connections, and that whole Soviet anti-Semitic Palestinian connection exists and has existed for years and years. And we still see that playing out today, albeit it's not the terrorists in Gaza, but of the propaganda put out by the Palestinian Authority. It has those traditional, very, very strong Soviet anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist themes all the way through.
Yeah,
that's also part of, similarly, also part of the Hamas Charter. Where does that all come into this whole equation?
Well, this is a really interesting moment and an interesting point, because Russia, of course, as you say, the Soviet Union was the source of much of the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist propaganda that we see today, for example, in America, on American campuses, that we see in the Palestinian propaganda. All of that whole kind of set of ideas that Zionism is racism and Zionism is fascism, and, Israelis propagating a genocide of the Palestinian people, the Holocaust inversions, real distortions of the Holocaust history. All of that can be found in Soviet anti-Zionist literature from the 1967 onward. That rhetoric ceased really when the Soviet Union fell apart. And I think it really just disappeared in a moment, and it kind of overnight. And Russian scholars have since written about how this propaganda was part of the Soviet foreign policy. And once the USSR fell apart and Russia became independent, and a relationship with Israel was reestablished, because from 1967 onward until the end of the USSR, it didn't have a relationship with Israel in the wake of the Six-Day War. So once all that happened, and 1 million Russian Jews, from former Soviet Jews from different parts of the former Soviet Union moved into Israel, a strong relationship became established. And then Putin found Israel as particularly in the last several years, a useful place and an ally. A supporting ally in certain narratives about the Red Army and the liberation of the camps. Already when it was losing the support of the West, after it invaded Ukraine in 2014, and the West started imposing its sanctions on Russia, Israel was still a good partner for Israel and could support this narrative. It was very important for Putin to propagate this narrative about the Great Red Army, etc. As a kind of historical justification for the idea of Great Russia. What we're seeing today is a return to some of that rhetoric, of that anti-Zionist rhetoric. You really hear it all the time. It's very easy for them to come back to it, because both Lavrov and Putin are the graduates of that Soviet system. They came out of the KGB and the foreign ministry that were part of, they created this rhetoric. So it's very easy for them to go back to that. As for and of course, that kind of anti-Zionism that they created was very much tied to traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It was very much tied to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, even to Nazi ideology. They just took it and rephrased it, all of the anti-Jewish tropes, and turned them into anti-Zionist tropes. Now, what's happening now is that Muslim majority republics is one thing, but the question always is, yes, what is happening in the Russian Orthodox majority Russian spaces? And here, I think that what we've all been wondering or worrying about for a long time, those of us who watch Russia closely, is the fact that, especially since the start of the war of Ukraine, the xenophobic rhetoric has really just ramped up. You see it on the propaganda channels, you see officials engaging in it. And anytime you have xenophobia going on the upswing, Jews also are in danger. And I think that it is now a moment when we particularly need to worry about Russian Jews. And I want to add here also that one of the reasons, Israel was criticized very heavily, including from inside the country, for not taking a stronger stance in support of Ukraine. And Israel, the two major reasons that Israel didn't do it had to do with Syria. And they also had to do with the fact that Russia still has some 300,000 Jews, people who identify as Jews. And Israelis always felt that they need to keep a channel open in case these Jews need to be evacuated. And I think that what happened in Makhachkala yesterday shows that we're certainly coming to that point, at least in some areas of Russia.
That we're coming to the point where Jews need to be
possibly
helped to leave. Unfortunately, that's something we're seeing all over the world. Even in London, just 2 days ago, 100,000 people marching, people shouting "Death to the Jews," and that's walking through the centre of London, which isn't doesn't have that necessarily that same virulent anti-Semitism as the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union that dissipated, and now Russia. Putin seems to be still trying to develop that idea of a relationship with the West. Where's that guy? How does he still see himself as someone who is capable of recultivating that almost good relationship that he had with the West? If we put back aside the old Cold War and the animosity and the proxy wars that went on even in the Middle East. For many years, Putin wasn't necessarily seen as an evil ruler. Now he is, and I think I understood you by saying that he sees this now as an opportunity to re-ingratiate himself with the West. Is that something that you think he sees as a real option? Is that something which he even wants?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking about in the West. So, for example, again, if you look at that statement that he put out regarding the war in Gaza, he over the last few years, he has really cultivated maybe too strong of a word, but the Kremlin understands that some of its messages appeal to individual audiences in the United States. So for example, some of its ideas appeal to the far left, and some of its ideas appear to the far right, to some elements in the Republican Party. And so, if you look, for example, at that statement about the Gaza war, he calls for a ceasefire. Well, there are, who is calling for the ceasefire right now in the West? It's the far left, the social democrats, the progressives, and the in the Congress. And so it's another signal to them that, okay, well, here's Russia, and you can sort of orient yourselves to Russia. Russia is potentially a friend. And with Republicans, those Republicans who are against supplying Ukraine with aid, this is also a potential kind of opening or channel for Putin's people to negotiate with and to make friends with.
But doesn't he see the hypocrisy in that? You can't at the same time be attacking and really destroying the Ukraine, and at the same time saying to Israel, well, there has to be a ceasefire with the genocidal terrorists from Hamas. Well, surely he himself sees that contradiction.
Well, and not to mention his condemnation of the destruction of, the deaths of civilians, of innocent civilians, and destruction of Gaza. This is after he leveled Mariupol and just an endless number of Ukrainian cities and towns.
Where he specifically targeted civilians, yes, as opposed to Israel, who we target the military targets. He specifically targeted civilians. He was responsible for the kidnap of hundreds of Ukrainian children, and which is now why there's an arrest warrant for him from the ICC.
And there is a view, there is an argument to be made that what's happening in Ukraine is a genocide. I mean, there are mass graves, right? Well, why, consistency has never been a value for Russian foreign policy or propaganda. In fact, it's very interesting because as I was watching one of his, I can't remember where he gave this talk. I think in one of his recent visits somewhere, he gave a talk about where he included these talking points, and and I was listening to him and I thought, well, what's interesting is that I think he was it escapes my mind now, but I think he visited a country in the Gulf. Anyway, we can look it up. But, I was thinking, well, right now he is being watched by Arab audiences. They never actually condemned the war in Ukraine. They never, the West just turned Putin into a pariah. But for the Arab world, it wasn't the case. And so here he is standing there condemning the civilian victims in Gaza. A lot of them may not even know what happened in Ukraine, or they may not care, and propaganda is really something that Russia understands really well. They know that what you say today supersedes what you said yesterday, what you said tomorrow supersedes what you said today. And consistency is just not part of the game. It's really all about current interests.
To what extent has Russia really maintained its military prowess? For the last year and a half, they've been involved already stuck in the war in the Ukraine. As we said, they've even taken drones from Iran, and they've been using them there. How much of that, really, the Russian prowess that we knew from the Cold War of this other superpower? We saw obviously that dissipating a little bit with the end of the Cold War and the disbursement of the USSR, but Russia was still considered to be a superpower. To what extent now is Russia capable of either helping the Arabs militarily as they used to do, or even politically with the influence that they have?
Well, I'm not a military expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly, couldn't break down the ammunitions, etc. I don't think that Russia is in a position to help anybody militarily right now. They're pretty stretched pretty thin. I think that one of the things that really amazed people when the war started, when the war with Ukraine started, was how what a poor condition Russian military was in. Yeah. So I don't think that it can help in that way. What it can offer politically, I'm also not sure. But I think it's just a question of reestablishing relationships right now, and then waiting for events to unfold and show what opportunities present themselves.
To see how this is going to play out, I think that, at least from my personal point of view, I think I would prefer to see Putin playing an integral role in helping to secure the release of the hostages, rather than giving over that role to Qatar, because Qatar is almost doing exactly the same. Qatar is, on the one hand, funding, supporting, hosting the Hamas terrorists and Hamas leadership, and on the other hand, trying to keep its good relations with the rest of the world, power that it's built up over the last few years, with the war in the Ukraine and supplying Europe with fuel, and really becoming that major world player, considering its small size. That relationship is with Hamas and with Israel is, I think, more toxic than the relationship with Russia, especially Russia in its current state. But would the Russian-Hamas relations? That's I think the important part. To what extent do you think that Hamas would listen to Russia over Iran?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I understand. Well, I understand the relationship between Hamas and Iran as compared to the Hamas versus Russia relationship. That's hard for me to say.
I mean, the Hamas and Iranian relationship is to start with very awkward in and of itself, Sunni and Shiites, and on the one hand, but also that whole relationship of Iran using Hamas, Hezbollah as their proxies, in the same way really as the Russians did, or the USSR did during the Cold War, using its proxies all the way around the world to fight these wars on their behalf and really doing their bidding. But Hamas really has enjoyed that patronage of Russia at the same time as Iran, and it would be I think more beneficial if we could understand really the extent of that relationship.
Well, and I want to say something that, what's interesting, and this actually points to the difference in the attitude of Israel toward Russia versus Washington, because Washington, this is something I've been watching for a few years, is that in Washington, you have a very hawkish attitude toward Russia. You've had it for many, many years already, since 2014. And of course, there's a long history of that. And I remember, for example, I think it was in 2018 or something like that, when Netanyahu was visiting Putin on the Red Square and participating in the May Day parade. This is where Netanyahu was useful to Putin, because Putin was already really isolated. Nobody was there with him to celebrate the parade, the victory, but Netanyahu was there. And so in Washington, they would look at that and they would say, well, why is Netanyahu being friendly with Putin? It's just so wrong. It looks so bad. But of course, it reflects the position, right? America, a big country sitting far away, versus Israel sitting right here, where Russia is on its border and there are Russian Jews, and Russia is influential, including it has influence inside Israel as well. It has all of these properties in Jerusalem that it wants to get back. So it's very complex, and of course it makes sense for Israel to want to maintain these relationships no matter what, but it's especially in the current situation when we're trying to get Israeli hostages back.
Well, we're talking about Russia playing possibly a bigger role in what it could do, and if nothing else, just allowing us to maintain, allowing Israel to maintain that operational flexibility in Syria to prevent even the constant flow of arms going to Hezbollah. Izabella, thank you. We have just a few questions. Yoni, if you have any questions for Izabella.
No. Maybe only one question. Whatever came out of this meeting with the Hamas delegation to Moscow, headed by Musa Abu Marzouk and the deputy foreign minister of Russia?
I'm not sure we know for sure what happened. Moscow was, the Kremlin spokesman was very certain or very insistent to say that the Kremlin did not meet with Hamas, Putin did not meet with Hamas, but we don't know what the results of it were.
Anyway, Hamas made a big thing out of it, distributing the pictures of the meeting and so on.
Yeah, well, they've been saying from the beginning that they view Putin as a supporter. They claim that Russia provides them with the bullets for their Kalashnikovs. They've even said, and I don't know if it's true or not, this is coming straight from them, but that they have license to manufacture Kalashnikovs in Gaza. I don't know if it's true. But sorting out what's true, what's not, it's hard, and it's unclear what the Kremlin and the foreign ministry have made of this meeting.
Okay.
Just one question from Lise Corzin, one of our regular participants. Isn't Russia's most important value to Israel right now stopping anti-Semitic behavior, as we saw in Dagestan, and delegitimizing it? I would assume really that answer is true. Most importantly, defending and making sure that the hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews aren't subject to widespread anti-Semitism.
Well, that is true, absolutely, and that's why I mentioned earlier today that Putin, right around just this evening, is going to have an important meeting where this issue will be discussed. I also want to point out, less noticed, one of the less noticed things that happened yesterday, that there was a pro-Hamas demonstration in Moscow. It was small. I think there weren't riots or anything like that. But what's interesting about it is that in Russia right now, you can't really hold public demonstrations unless there is an explicit permission. I mean, the people who have tried to protest against the war in Ukraine, for example, have been arrested even when they come out into the street alone and they stand in the corner of the street with a blank sheet of paper. Nothing is written on the blank sheet of paper, and they get arrested. So the fact that a pro-Hamas demonstration took place in the streets of Moscow caught the attention of people who understand these dynamics. And the one thing that occurred to me, and I only judge from past experience, is that very often, Putin in relationships with both Americans and Israelis, Putin will kind of generate events that will force Israelis to come and talk to him. So, he takes, for example, quote unquote hostages. So there's now an American journalist who is now being held in Moscow. There's also an American businessman who's being held in Moscow for people call it as like he creates this pool of hostages, for future negotiations as they may be required. At some point, an Israeli woman was seized by Russia, and then Netanyahu was forced to go and get her. So what occurred to me is I wonder if this is one of those situations where it creates an opening, right? A forced opening, like it forces Israelis to come and talk to Putin. So that may also be another side of the story.
I mean, he can't condemn Hamas because he's doing exactly the same things, targeting civilians, taking hostages, which would possibly explain why he wouldn't be able to condemn them. Although we've seen that being contradictory in his statements isn't necessarily a problem for him.
Right.
Izabella, thank you very much for joining us. Yoni, thank you for joining us. We will be back with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock Israel time. We understand that the times in America have shifted a little bit for those joining us, as they say in England, from across the pond. We apologize for that, but we understand that time lapse will soon be covered. So we join us again tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock. We hope to see you again. Have a good evening. Stay safe.